welcome to another live stream of the History By podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Hugo Mendez. And today we're discussing his new book titled The Gospel of John, A New History. I'll link to purchase the book in the description below and pinned comment. That being said, Hugo, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Jacob. Really glad to be here.
So I want to start us off with two things. But this two-part question: when was the Gospel of John written? And can you tell us about the hidden authorship of the Gospel?
Yeah, so the Gospel of John's date is not an easy one to trace down, but most scholars, including myself, would place it between the years 90 and 110. This is, kind of a really rough window. It's basically based on the idea that John probably knew the earlier Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, something that I defend in this book, something that Mark Goodacre has given excellent expression to in his most recent book. In fact, I'll put it out right here, the Fourth Synoptic Gospel. So I think, it probably comes after the year 90 or so. It might be up until the kind of early 2nd century, but there are a few works that come after this text that require it to be probably no later than 110. That's a really kind of rough guess. But something, I think, early 2nd century, but just near the turn of the 2nd century. In terms of the hidden authorship, the other problem with the Gospel of John is that our many manuscripts for the Gospel of John call it the Gospel according to John. But these are titles that were added, we think, by and large as a field at a later time by scribes. These are not the kinds of titles, Gospel according to John, Gospel according to Luke, that are of the type that ancient authors would have placed on their own works. And this shouldn't be surprising, right? We kind of widely presume that many biblical books did not originally carry titles. Take something like a letter, the letter we know is 3rd John. Nobody writes a personal letter and slaps 3rd John at the top as a title. Later scribes are adding in these titles. The title makes us think that this gospel comes from someone named John, but we have every reason to think it was added later. The text itself is actually anonymous. It doesn't name or identify its author. And so we as historians have to look into the texts for clues as to its authorship. That's what I do in chapter 1 of the Gospel of John, A New History, the book you just pointed out that's out now with Oxford, where I try to take what the text gives us about this author to kind of compose a rough picture of who this individual hidden author was.
And is the author of the Gospel of John attempting to give the impression that the beloved disciple is the author? And is the text leaving the impression that John the son of Zebedee is that individual?
Yeah, those are two great questions. So I stand definitely with the majority of scholars of the Gospel of John, and actually with the majority of readers of the Gospel of John, in saying that the text definitely wants to give you the impression that the disciple, this character that's called the disciple whom Jesus loved, is the person who has written this text. So at the very beginning of the book, in chapter 1, verse 14, the author clearly positions himself as an eyewitness of the life of Jesus. Speaking of Jesus as the Word, as the Logos, this very complicated idea that the author brings out right at the beginning of his book, he says that the Word was made flesh and dwelled among us, and we have seen his glory. So there's this notion that Jesus came to earth, lived among the kind of people that the author represents, and that the author is one of those who has seen Jesus. In chapter 19, verse 35, the author begins to do other things. By the latter parts of this book, the author has started telling you about a disciple whom Jesus loved, a very enigmatic, nameless figure that seems to be Jesus's closest disciple. Already in chapter 13, you see that he sits right beside Jesus, reclines right next to Jesus in the most privileged position at the table. He is the disciple who stays with Jesus through his arrest up to his crucifixion. And in 1935, the author gives you the impression that this individual is, if not one of the eyewitnesses responsible for writing the book, then the eyewitness who writes the book. anyways, and so what happens is that, in chapter 20, this figure continues to have a major role. And then whoever wrote chapter 21, whether it was the original author or, as I think, a later scribe who added chapter 21, that author makes it very clear that in chapter 21, verse 24, in his words, that this is the disciple, the disciple whom Jesus loved, is the one who has written these things, who testifies these things and has written these things. And so across the book, the Gospel of John is trying to convince you that this particular disciple is the ultimate author of this book. Some people do kind of a different variation of this. Some people tend to think that perhaps the author's writings has come into the hands of some other group of people who write as a we voice. I think that's a plausible interpretation of the gospel. But the reality is that ancient authors tended to move between we and I language really freely. I document this quite a bit in my book. And so I think it's very likely that we're looking at a gospel that conceives of itself as really written by one author who sometimes speaks in the we, sometimes as an I, sometimes in the third person, and sometimes jumbles all of those different self-references together. Now, for the second part of your question, you did ask, is this person meant to be John, the son of Zebedee? And that's another thing that scholars tend to debate. There are definitely scholars who have defended the idea that the gospel means John, the son of Zebedee, not necessarily because they think that John wrote the gospel. I pointed out Mark Goodacre's Fourth Synoptic Gospel. He thinks the gospel very much wants you to see John, the son of Zebedee, as the author of this text. I tend to disagree. I think a lot of scholars disagree. Harry Attridge, David Litwa, myself being among them. I think that this character, the disciple whom Jesus loved, is just fundamentally impossible to identify with any single character. He's not John, the son of Zebedee, for a few reasons. One of them is that nothing about this figure, it quite lines up with what we know about John, the son of Zebedee, from other sources. If you read the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, John, the son of Zebedee, is from Galilee. He's a fisherman. He's supposed to be uneducated, according to the book of Acts. The author of this gospel presents himself as, never gives any kind of backstory for himself, presents himself as someone in chapter 18 who seems to have access to the high priest's house, a personal friendship and connection to the high priest in Jerusalem, which is different from anything that we would probably say about John, the son of Zebedee. The author obviously is highly literate, philosophically sophisticated, which is different. Another weird thing is that nearly every episode that John, the son of Zebedee, is in the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, these would be episodes like when Jesus calls the apostle John, the disciple John, to himself, to be a follower of his. The Transfiguration, where Jesus appears to Peter, James, and John in a flash of light. Or even Gethsemane, where Jesus, on the night before his arrest, is pained and takes Peter, James, and John to see his sufferings in prayer before his crucifixion. None of those scenes appear in the Gospel of John. And so you'd have a really hard time trying to understand how, if this text is meant to look like it's written by John, that it could be written by someone like John. That's why other scholars have considered other possibilities. There are quite a number of scholars, including some conservative scholars, who have argued that this figure could be Lazarus. Lazarus is an interesting figure because it says in chapter 11 that Jesus loves him. It's only after Lazarus is introduced that you start hearing about this other disciple. But there are other aspects of Lazarus that don't work. Lazarus is never called a disciple. Most importantly, again, this other disciple, the disciple whom Jesus loved, in chapter 18 is said to have a friendship with the high priest and is able to go into the house of the high priest freely. If you look at chapter 12, the high priest is currently trying to kill Lazarus. So this figure cannot be Lazarus, this person who's welcomed into the home of the high priest. So I think you just find dead ends everywhere you turn. And I think that's really deliberate. I think that the author chose a figure to be the narrator of his gospel that was invented. I think a figure that is a literary creation, one that isn't easy to identify with anyone else. And the idea is that this figure has supposedly eyewitness access to Jesus and the credibility that comes with that. But because we don't know that figure's name, they're hard both to verify or to disprove their existence, right? If you don't know someone's name, you can't quite confirm their existence, but you can't also easily disprove their existence. So even if the author kind of leaves hints that this figure is a disciple of Jesus, perhaps arguably one of the 12 disciples of Jesus, he kind of teases you with this dead end that you don't know which of the 12 or which of the followers of Jesus he might be. And I think this is part of the intentional, deliberate design of the gospel to keep you guessing.
How does the Gospel of John portray Jesus in contrast to the Synoptics?
Yeah, so the Gospel of John definitely portrays Jesus differently than the synoptic gospels do in very important ways. So, for one thing, the synoptic gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, will present Jesus as a human being, albeit one who clearly has something supernatural about him. I think when you read the Gospel of Mark, you get to chapter 9 and the transfiguration scene occurs. Jesus is with his followers, Peter, James, and John, on a mountain. And suddenly, again, you get this kind of flash of light where Jesus sort of rips the mask off who he is, and they see his face shining like the sun. They see this kind of transcendent, epiphanic Jesus. The kind of imagery in that chapter is the kind that is associated with the revealing of gods and demigods in ancient literature. So I think it's very clear when you read these gospels that Jesus is human, but he's more than human. He's higher up the ladder of life. He's supernatural somehow. How exactly that works, how they understand it, is left a bit of a mystery. John does not leave it a mystery. John says very explicitly what he thinks Jesus's nature and origins are. Right at the beginning of the text, you have the very famous lines that begin John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God or divine. So the book presents Jesus as the pre-existent Word of God, the Logos of God in Greek. This is essentially casting Jesus as the mind, the reason, the thought of God. There's a deep philosophical tradition in Judaism, a Hellenistic Jewish philosophical tradition, exemplified by such figures as Philo, that understood that the ultimately transcendent God mediated his relationship with the world ultimately through a mind creative reason, logic of his own. Just the way that we can sometimes abstractify our mind and think about our minds as in some abstract level different from ourselves, among ancient Jewish philosophers, building on even earlier Greek philosophical models, there is this notion that God's mind is its own entity that can interact and engage with the created world. John identifies that mind of God, that reason of God, that logos of God, as fundamentally the creator, the instrument of creating the universe, and an entity that one day, according to 114, became flesh, that became, if you will, condensed in a human person, in a human body, namely the person we know as Jesus and the central figure of the Gospel of John. And so that's really central to how John portrays Jesus. And John gives you this really kind of complicated vision where the Logos, again, becomes flesh in the person of Jesus, but then ultimately at the end of his life departs again to the world above, this world realm that he's originally from. And the gospel traces this arc in detail.
When you look at the historical issues in the Gospel of John, what kind of issues do you see in it?
Yeah, so the Gospel of John, as one of the four Gospels, has long been used by believers and even scholars to some extent to excavate details of the life of Jesus. Um, But it's always been, at least for scholars in the 20th and 21st centuries, a problematic source for that history. The reason, in part, has to do with the speeches of Jesus that appear in the gospel. If you read the Gospel of John, Jesus has a very particular way of speaking, and he has very particular teachings to communicate. He teaches fundamentally that he is a special divine being who has come to earth. And throughout his teachings, he elaborates what he will do for humans. As I capture in the book, Jesus in John is a divine being who has come to make human beings into celestial divine beings. In the gospel, he teaches that he implants a new life of spirit in the human person. As he tells Nicodemus in chapter 3, they are born of spirit, Greek pneuma, and they become spirit. So they have a new hidden life, hidden nature as spirit inside their bodies of flesh and blood. Jesus teaches in the Gospel of John, as I continue elaborating in chapter 2, that now in spirit and as spirit, they can dwell in the spiritual Jesus can dwell in them. And through that, they have access to celestial realms. Even now, in this body of flesh and blood, in and as spirit, believers, according to the Gospel of John, can now be essentially in celestial heavenly places, and they can see God in a way that other human beings can't. According to the gospel, too, because human beings in their insides have been made into pneuma, have been made into spirit, my modern Greek pronunciation there, they are now able also to have immortal, eternal life. See, the key is that our flesh and blood bodies are really poor vehicles for eternal life in ancient philosophical thought. Our bodies age, our bodies get injured, our bodies die and decay. If you want to live forever, you need a body that is suited for eternal life. Ancient philosophers looking up at the sky, thinking about entities like the stars and the sun, imagined that they were made of another substance, a celestial substance. And they had different names for these potential celestial substances, and among them also spirit, pneuma. And that's how the Gospel of John understands the nature of God. In chapter 4, the Gospel teaches that God is spirit, God is pneuma. And in the same way, Jesus teaches that when human beings come to believe in Jesus, they become pneuma. And that then means that they can live forever, that even in this life, even though they have flesh and blood bodies, they can live eternally. The gospel also teaches that through this same process of becoming like God, as they now have the nature of spirit, now as they are able to live forever, human beings also experience a new oneness with God. And in chapter 10, Jesus hints that human beings are also able to be called gods with a small g. They partake of divinity, an idea that would have far-reaching reverberations in different Christian traditions, Catholic, Orthodox, etc. So this entire package of teachings is what Jesus' speeches are filled with in the Gospel of John. The difficulty is all of these emphases are not the emphases of Jesus in the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. If you read through the speeches in there, you'll find lots of teachings of Jesus, but Jesus is not going to be talking about how he will spiritually indwell his disciples. He is not going to be explaining complicated ideas of oneness with God and deification. If these ideas were as central to Jesus' teachings as the Gospel of John would make them out to be, where at every opportunity Jesus is speaking about becoming spirit and abiding in me and all of these distinctive ideas, then you'd have to wonder, why do the other Gospels omit it? Instead, what we as scholars think is that whoever wrote John had his own theology and essentially made Jesus into the mouthpiece of that theology. That Jesus reflects the synthesis of an author writing decades after his life, who has combined Hellenistic Jewish philosophy, the teachings, in my view, of the Apostle Paul, other sorts of influences in early second century Christianity, and has brought together lots of new speeches that then for that reason would not necessarily be historical. Another thing that I note in the book, and I really trace this out in chapter 3, is that when you look at the stories of the Gospel of John, these stories almost seem tailor-made to reflect that theology. Key words in Jesus's speeches, key words that will only structure Jesus' speeches in John, are also the key words that structure stories. The transformation of water into wine, the raising of the paralyzed man in chapter 5, the healing of the official son in chapter 4, the raising of Lazarus in chapter 11. And if you read these stories carefully, you'll see that these stories are actually symbolic. They're gestures that Jesus does to illustrate ideas in his teachings. So, to take a single example, in chapter 2, Jesus goes to a wedding feast and he transforms water into wine. The water is brought to the person who's in charge of the feast, the steward of the feast. And it says, when he drank the water that had become wine, he did not know where it came from. Well, what's interesting about that is if you turn to the next chapter, Jesus is with Nicodemus, and he tells them that when he plants a new life of spirit inside the person, he says that people will not know where it comes from. He says, just as the wind comes and the wind goes and you don't know where it comes from, so it is with those who are born of spirit. So this scene where Jesus transforms water into wine, it's not a simple party trick in the gospel. It's symbolic of a central teaching of the book that human beings in a hidden way are transformed from one thing into another. Water into wine is a symbol of how we as flesh and blood humans acquire a new life as spirit, are born of spirit. So when you put that all together, speeches that don't match up with what we know about Jesus from other sources, stories that seem tailor-made to symbolize emphases in these speeches, that also in some ways disagree with what we find in other gospels. You can find several scenes that seem to contradict or at least stand in tension with what you found in previous gospels. I think that ultimately a lot of the material in John is not historical. It is tailor-made to communicate a theology. It has been invented for that purpose. And in that respect, I think I stand on a very long legacy of John scholars who have seen creativity at play in this gospel.
So we have a super chat question from Daniel Bradford. Thank you for your super chat. Did Yahweh send Jesus or a different transcendent God? Compare Marcion with the Jewish Davidic links added later, as done to the as done to the Pauline letters.
That is a fantastic question. John definitely teaches that there's a transcendent God that has sent Jesus. Jesus in the gospel says that to his hearers, for instance, in chapter 8, that you don't know this God, that he tells Jews, a crowd of Jews, that they don't know this God. And so that has led at least, a few scholars, I think specifically right now of David Litwa, to suggest that perhaps this God who has sent Jesus is distinct from the Judean God, from Yahweh. I think what's problematic a little bit about that, or at least what I would want to nuance, is other aspects of the gospel seem to suggest that figures like Abraham, figures like Isaiah, these prophets from the Hebrew Bible, had in some ways had visionary access. And so Jesus will talk about how these prophetic figures have seen me, how they have prophesied, how they have had scriptures that are fulfilled of his coming, which could suggest that what John is doing is something a little more delicate and creative. He seems to understand that human beings fundamentally, non-believers as he would see them, worship a false god. I think it seems pretty clear that this false god is this entity that's called the ruler of this world. But I think that the gospel tends to imagine, I think the kind of concept underneath the gospel is that there is a transcendent God who is revealed through the Logos, through Jesus, in these kind of epiphanic moments, including in the Hebrew Bible, and that therefore the Logos itself is Yahweh, or at the very least participates in the nature of Yahweh if you think of the transcendent God as Yahweh. And that this ruler of the world is a separate entity. Obviously, second century Christians would arrive at a very different synthesis. Some of them will end up with a system like what David Litwa suggests for the Gospel of John, where the Judean God is a false God, Yahweh is a false God. I just don't see that happening in the Gospel of John because of some of the positive ways that it works with biblical tradition. But that's an excellent question.
Can you tell us a bit about John's use of synoptics? What does he take from the synoptics and integrate into the new narrative that the text creates?
Yeah. So, just as a side note, if you followed John's scholarship for the last few decades, you might have known that earlier generations of John scholars in the late 20th century thought that the Gospel of John might have been an independent gospel, that it was not written by that it was not written by someone who had read Mark, Matthew, and Luke. That view has shifted considerably. And I would say that today, the new majority view, if not very quickly, the new consensus is becoming that, in fact, John did know the synoptics. John probably knew, of course, lots of different oral and potentially written sources for the life of Jesus. I think what we would say today, overwhelmingly, as John scholars who actually work in this text today, is that there's no reason to exclude one or more of the synoptic gospels, one or more of Mark, Matthew, and Luke from this list. But what's clear is that John doesn't use the gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke the way that they use one another. So, for those scholars of earlier generations, the reason why they thought that John didn't use the synoptics is that you could look at Mark and you can look at Matthew and you can look at Luke, and it's very clear that they have extensive word for word parallels. You can get to places where dozens and dozens of words in a row are roughly in common between these gospels. John doesn't have those kind of verbatim similarities. That being said, it does have lots of other parallels, some small verbatim similarities, and this shouldn't be surprising. We think as scholars that the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Proto-Gospel of James, knew earlier Gospels like Mark, Matthew, and Luke. They just decided not necessarily to copy them as extensively as they copied one another. What Mark, Matthew, and Luke do is instead kind of unusual in the ancient world, to just, copy, if you will, loosely plagiarize from earlier authors that extensively. So John plays creatively with the synoptics. When he sits down, I can't tell you necessarily that he has a copy of Mark, Matthew, and Luke in front of him. I don't tend to think so. I think what most likely happened is that the author of John had been exposed to these gospels at different times. Maybe he had an ancient writing tablet, a wax tablet, like the little one in the corner right behind me, and jotted down notes and perhaps tiny excerpts from those gospels that he consulted when writing his own text. But what happens is that John will take synoptic stories and reimagine them, reformat them, and creatively, precisely to communicate the central ideas of his theology. So if you read the Gospel of, for instance, Matthew, there's a story where Jesus heals someone's son. The Gospel of Luke or at least someone's youth. That's the word in Greek, but it's kind of commonly taken to be a son. When you read the Gospel of Luke, this figure is understood to be a slave or servant of the person who approaches Jesus, a centurion who's asking for this healing. John will take aspects of that. He'll create a new story in chapter 4 that looks tantalizingly like those stories. Here, Jesus is asked by an official to have his son healed. But the story has been rewritten in ways that, again, as I noted with the symbolism of John, draw out all of the major themes of John's text. In John's new story, this figure, this son, is healed at a certain hour as his father believes in the word of Jesus. And what's interesting is, if you turn to the very next chapter of the book, Jesus teaches that an hour is coming when anyone who believes my words will live. It's not surprising then, again, that in the earlier chapter, believe, word of Jesus, the word that Jesus says is, in fact, your son will live. It's the same terms he uses in the next scene. All of these connections are ways that the author takes a synoptic story, changes it, but changes it to infuse it with his own distinctive views of Jesus, but more importantly, his distinctive views of what Jesus does for humans, that he gives them immortality, that he exalts them, that he gives them divinity, some share in divine life. That's how John is creatively using the synoptics.
How does John portray Jesus' ministry?
So John keeps essentially the same basic format of the Gospel of Mark. He imagines that Jesus had a baptism early in his life, which is probably as secure a historical datum as any for the life of Jesus. He imagines that, he tells the story of how Jesus does so many miracles. And like Mark, halfway through his book, he begins talking about the last week of Jesus' life. He goes into Jerusalem, and he ultimately, is crucified. And then there's an entire narrative where the disciples find his tomb empty and begin having appearances of the risen Jesus, proving that he's been resurrected. That basic structure stays the same in John. What John does, though, of course, is he infuses all of these new stories. Less than 10% of the Gospel of John has clear parallels in the other Gospels. Most of the Gospel of John is new material. And this new material takes on very interesting forms. One of the things that I note in the book is that John seems to anticipate the ways that later apocryphal Gospels, the Gospels of Thomas, for instance, Mary, the Proto-Gospel of James, will infuse novel, innovative, fabricated materials about the life of Jesus into their own Gospels. The Gospel of Thomas, for instance, focuses on unrecorded moments in the life of Jesus, things you haven't seen in other Gospels. In Thomas and Mary, especially in Judas, you hear that some of these moments are actually private exchanges that Jesus only had with select individuals who were privileged to receive select information. Well, John has the same motif. He's got private exchanges with Nicodemus, with Martha in chapter 11, with the Samaritan woman in chapter 4. It uses this technique to kind of fill the gospel with new contents that carry the weight of its new theology. John does other things that are really interesting too. Throughout the gospel, the author of John weaves cryptic speech. So in the Gospel of Thomas, for instance, Jesus is really hard to understand. He tells all these riddles, he speaks cryptically. In the Gospel of John, Jesus does the same thing. He's constantly speaking in ways that leave his readers confused. In chapter 3, Nicodemus can't make heads or tails of what Jesus is trying to tell him. And so this is another way that John is reconfiguring stories and building a new narrative that's actually very different from what we find in the synoptics. So that's roughly how John tells the story of Jesus.
So we have a question
Mhm.
from Richard Fellows. What are Hugo's views on John the Elder as the author of John?
Yeah, so I'm pretty skeptical of the idea that John the Elder is the author of John. I don't think that that's the case. So there are some scholars who notice, for instance, that there's an ancient work, lost work, by a writer named Papias called The Exposition of the Sayings of the Lord, or something along those lines, that in which the author mentions that he has had access to material that comes from essentially eyewitnesses to the life of Jesus. And he lists a few different figures. He lists the name John twice. The second time he calls him John the Elder. And it's not entirely clear to scholars if this John is meant to be the same John, the son of Zebedee, that we hear about perhaps in the same section of the book that's quoted for us by Eusebius. This is actually where this fragment of the book is preserved. Or if this is meant to be a different John, which then gets called John the Elder by scholars. There are scholars that I think make very persuasive arguments in both directions. I can't necessarily tell you if Papias has one John or two Johns in mind. It seems to me that Irenaeus thinks he only has one John in mind in each case, something that Eusebius has to argue against, but there we are. But scholars, some scholars have thought that perhaps this John the Elder then might be the John who wrote the gospel. The problems with this are a few for me. Number one, again, we don't necessarily know that John the Elder is different from John the son of Zebedee for Papias. I think that's an open question because we don't actually have Papias's lost work. It's gone. It only exists in these tiny fragments, these tiny quotations. So we already have the problem of just wondering, is John the Elder a separate person? Uh, Secondly, the next thing you kind of have to reckon with is whether John the Elder is, if he is a separate person, a real person. The problem a little bit with the references to John the Elder is that they come to us from Papias, and Papias is unreliable in many of the traditions that he gives us. The traditions about how the Gospels originated, the traditions, for instance, about Judas Iscariot are very clearly highly speculative and embellished and contradict what we find in other Jewish and other Christian sources, which are themselves at tension with each other. And so, already there's this kind of question of, if this is the only place we find this figure, can we really trust this figure? Later writers will talk about John the Elder or a figure like that, but they're relying on Papias for the name of this figure, the existence of this figure. The next question you have to deal with then is, why would you have John the Elder be the author of the Gospel of John? See, the only reason you would want to connect him to the Gospel of John is that the book was called John since antiquity, that's the title that was given this book. But I will note two things about that. Number one, when ancient authors explain who the John is who wrote this book, they always say John the son of Zebedee. If you go through and through all of these ancient authors who are mentioning this book, they are not crediting the gospel to John the Elder. And this is something that I call out in chapter 6 of my book, that scholars sometimes have a way of cherry picking our evidence, that they like to take a patristic tradition that perhaps someone like a John the Elder existed, and then they use this datum in completely different ways than the ancient authors ever intended or ever understood it. So yes, John the Elder might have existed according to Papias, but the one thing, and Irenaeus and some of these authors depended on Papias, but the one thing that Irenaeus and Clement and Eusebius are not telling you is that John the Elder wrote the gospel. It's always John the son of Zebedee, or in the case of Irenaeus, John the disciple of the Lord, who I think we should identify with John the son of Zebedee. Certainly, I don't think Irenaeus, according to Eusebius, is making any kind of distinction between John the Elder and John the son of Zebedee. So I think those are some of the problems that you face with that interpretation. I think it's much easier to simply claim that the Gospel of John got its title John, not from necessarily the name of a figure like John the Elder, but from a pretty simple deduction on the part of early Christians. The Gospel of John claims it was written by the disciple whom Jesus loved, who clearly is presented in chapter 13 as the closest disciple to Jesus, sitting in the most privileged position at the table with Jesus at the Last Supper. So, who is this disciple? If you know the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, you would quickly think to yourself, as most ancient Christians would have, well, Jesus had three closest disciples, Peter, James, and John. This figure cannot be Peter, because Peter appears with the disciple whom Jesus loved in various scenes. So they are not the same person. That leaves James and John. The problem with James is that according to Acts 12, he died young. Our tradition suggests that James died not soon, long after, only a few years after Jesus died. The only disciple who was thought from that inner circle to have lived for several decades who was not Peter was John. And so I think it was just a very quick deduction on the part of ancient Christians that John, the son of Zebedee, must be this disciple. I don't think that's what the author had in mind. Again, I think the author at least had ambiguity in mind. He didn't really care which disciple you identified this with. He leaves the question open. He leaves the question ambiguous. But I don't think that we can necessarily stake all our claims on John the Elder the way that some late 20th century scholars did. Thanks for the question.
What do you make of the signs material in the Gospel of John?
Yeah, so the miracles of Jesus in the gospel are called signs. That's the preferred vocabulary in John. And early on in the book, in chapter 2, the first miracle of Jesus at Cana is called the first sign of Jesus. Later on in chapter 2 and chapter 3, you'll hear that Jesus, of course, did many other signs. And then in chapter 4, when Jesus heals the official son, this is said to be the second sign when Jesus came into Galilee. And so some people have noticed that it's kind of a weird thing. It's what we call a classic aporia of the gospel, a classic skip or seam, a weird tension where the gospel seems to start numbering the miracles of Jesus, but between the first and second sign, it mentions that there are other signs. So how is this one exactly the second sign? What does that all mean? And so some late 20th century scholars, mid 20th century scholars had posited that perhaps John was reliant on some earlier source for the life of Jesus, what they hypothetically called the sign source. Maybe some source that did have the miracles of Jesus described in a sequential order that then the gospel author took over and adapted for his own purposes. I'm skeptical of the sign source hypothesis. And in fact, I would say that a majority of John scholars today are skeptical of it. One of the reasons that I'm skeptical of it is that so few of these miracles, of course, participate in this entire enumeration system. It's really just two of them that have this sort of issue. I think a second thing is that this language of signs and the numbering of signs can be explained in some different ways, potentially in the author's own complicated compositional process. If you imagine that the Gospel of John was written by someone who might have worked on the manuscript for several years, editorial mistakes of their own might have crept in. I think you don't have to posit a separate hypothetical lost source to explain how a single author makes mistakes. If you go through a book manuscript of mine, you're going to find inconsistencies, typos, just little things that naturally come into even academic writing and that, a press might miss in copy editing or things like that. That's very natural for contemporary writers, even with many more resources than ancient authors had at their disposal. So that's another issue. I think a third reason why we're very skeptical of the sign source today in John studies is that hypothetical reconstructions of this source are just all over the board. There's never been a clear consensus of what this sign source looked like, a common hypothesis of where it extends, because again, there's just so little data to support it in the first place, so few places where you can really stake a flag on this. But the final reason why I'm skeptical is simply when you look at the stories in John that are in question here, right? Take, for instance, the wedding at Cana, take the healing of the official son. Those are stories that are thoroughly worked over by the gospel author, where they are just so very clearly shaped by Johannine themes, shaped by John's specific emphases. And to the extent that they might have a core, in the case of the healing of the official son, that core looks a lot like a story from the Synoptic Gospels. To claim that there's this other place that he's getting it from a hypothetical source, I think just kind of misses the obvious source we do have for that story, which is Matthew and Luke. So for all those reasons, I'm not especially fond of the sign source hypothesis. And again, in that respect, I think for all my maverick tendencies, actually stand very much, again, in the majority with most John scholars.
So I'd like to go back to the beloved disciple. Do you think that the beloved disciple could be a fabricated character, since he doesn't really fit in with any of the known disciples at all?
Yeah, that's what I think is fundamentally happening. This is a figure that is invented for a particular purpose. I think I'm perfectly open to the idea that the Gospel of John intends you to understand this figure as one of the 12 disciples, given his proximity to Jesus, given the fact that he's present at the Last Supper, John chapters 13 to 17, when Jesus is among those whom he has chosen, which John 6 tells us it's the 12 that are chosen. This is an argument that Mark Goodacre makes in his book. I'm happy with that idea. But again, I think the author has not decided to assign this particular disciple, this particular character, a specific name. He wants to keep this figure ambiguous. And part of what that accomplishes for the author is that it makes this figure kind of a more blank canvas for the author to play on, to play with. So one thing that's very clear about the beloved disciple in John is that he's an idealized character. If you read the Gospel of John, all the other disciples of Jesus abandoned Jesus, just as they do in Mark, Matthew, and Luke. But this character, this unknown, mysterious, enigmatic character, doesn't do that. He's portrayed in this very idealized way where he remains faithful to Jesus even when everyone abandons him. In many ways, he becomes the model of what an ideal disciple should do. In other ways, this disciple gets to kind of inhabit a space that presents him in a different mold from the other disciples. When Peter comes to the empty tomb in John chapter 20 and discovers the tomb empty, he's confused, but this disciple believes. And so again, that serves the author's purpose to use this figure to exemplify, illustrate a certain kind of belief. But there's one more thing that this figure does really well by being anonymous. He gets to be, I think, in some ways, a living disciple of Jesus. If we presume, again, that the Gospel of John is written around the turn of the 2nd century, early 2nd century, then this figure is writing almost a century after Jesus lived, right? After he died, certainly, but a century after Jesus lived, when you would not expect, and when probably many Christians knew, all of the major disciples of Jesus that were well known, Peter, James, John, had died probably decades before. And so, arguably in some of these cases, but, again, we have such limited data, but that's probably a very fair presumption. And so by making this figure anonymous, the author is able to essentially construct the disciple you don't know about, the disciple who potentially could still be writing at this late date, or at least a figure whose trajectory was not known. So when this gospel suddenly surfaces decades later, you're not immediately surprised that it is written by an eyewitness, just simply because you don't know this eyewitness. So I think it's a validating, authenticating strategy of the gospel too, to assign it to someone enigmatic, anonymous.
What do you make of the book of Revelation, and was it written before or after the Gospel of John?
Yeah. So one of the things that I really enjoyed doing in this book was to give my opinion on absolutely all kinds of issues. Like if you're watching this podcast and you're, halfway interested in this, I really wrote a book that crawls into every crevice of the Gospel of John and gets into all these issues. And one of the issues that I get to, that I try to revive, is this question of how is John related to Revelation? For nearly 2,000 years, Christians identified John as being a work by the same author as the book of Revelation. The reason is that they had already attributed the Gospel of John to John, the son of Zebedee. And when they opened up the book of Revelation, they saw that the central character of this book actually calls himself John, and they identified that character with John, the son of Zebedee. Now, this explanation was already problematic in early Christian centuries. In the 3rd century, we know that a Christian named Dionysius of Alexandria, wrote an entire work that Eusebius quotes portions of, in which he argued that no, John and Revelation are very different books and could not have come from the same pen, the same mind, the same author. And that case has been persuasive for many scholars, where today, if you ask most scholars who work on John, they think of Revelation as a very different book with a very different authorship. I've nuanced this a little bit in this book. And at the end of chapter 6, at the end of my book, I argue that there's a possibility here that what's happened is that the Gospel of John has created this disciple whom Jesus loved, that Christians were very quickly identifying as perhaps being John, the son of Zebedee, and that in the wake of the Gospel of John's composition, another figure wrote this book called Revelation and hopped onto this tradition that John was writing books, and actually wrote an apocalypse in the name of John. I think that the John of Revelation is probably not just any John, but specifically meant to be John, the son of Zebedee. And I think that the author meant his book to be interpreted as a book by the same author as the gospel. It's really telling that when you look at the framing chapters of the book of Revelation, so for instance, chapter 1, there's a concentration, as Jörg Frey points out, of Johannine-like language. Word of God, testimony is brought out in a certain way, a figure who claims to have seen Jesus. These are things that are reminiscent of the Gospel of John. But then the book, of course, takes you down very different avenues in the Gospel of John. And that's not weird for pseudepigrapha, for falsely authored works. Sometimes a pseudepigraphon, as Dale Allison argues, can just try to connect itself at the very beginning to an ancient author, a presumed author, and then just go about its merry way, sounding nothing like that author. Second Peter knows the letter of First Peter, but it sounds very different in Greek. The Apocryphon of John knows the Gospel of John, but it doesn't sound anything like the Gospel of John when you get into the heart and meat of what it says. It only just purports to be by John. So I think something similar could be happening with Revelation, where it is a later falsely authored work, pseudepigraphon, forgery, if you will, in a kind of looser term, that in some ways is presenting itself as if it's written by the author of the gospel, but that is not actually written by that author, that falsely presents itself as such. One of the reasons why I think this is plausible is the dating issue, as you mentioned. If the Gospel of John was written between, let's say, the years 90 and 110, that's again very rough, but that's kind of the framework most John scholars use and that I agree still works, then in that case, if you look at the consensus dating of the book of Revelation, James Kelhofer says that the consensus dating currently is somewhere between the years 90 to 110, but perhaps extending even farther than that. And in that case, you can imagine a scenario where John being written in this year might have quickly spawned this particular text at a later year. I think that's plausible. I don't think we can say all of this with certainty, but I think there are really compelling reasons, really compelling evidence exists to support this idea. And that's what I draw out in chapter 6 of my book.
What do you make of the Johannine epistles?
Yeah. So in chapter 5 of my book, I argue, as I have in a different book, article, Did the Johannine Community Exist? Which is an open access article. You can find it online. And as I will argue in my next book, The Epistles of John, Origins, Authorship, Purpose, which is coming out with Cambridge in a few months, I argue that the letters of John are also themselves falsely authored works that are modeled after, imitate, are written in the same tradition as the Gospel of John, which is a falsely authored works. They are, in a loose sense, right, forgeries written in the likeness of a forgery. Whoever wrote the Gospel of John presented it as the work of someone that it was not. He presents it as the work of an eyewitness that I don't think existed. And then the epistles of John, these letters of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, I think are meant to appear to have been written by that same author. Admittedly, scholars have noted for about a century, going back to, for instance, among others, the work of C.H. Dodd, that the epistles of John don't look like the Gospel of John. In some discernible ways, it's very clear that they seem to be written by different authors, or one or more authors. But there are really tantalizing similarities throughout. And scholars, Johannine scholars, have known for decades that the only way to explain the similarities that bind John, 1st John, 2nd John, and 3rd John together is by direct literary copying. If you look at 2nd John, you can see where it matches up word for word in many places with segments of 1st John, which itself matches up in some cases word for word with things you find in the Gospel of John. There seems to have been literary copying between these texts. What I argue is that literary copying served a purpose. It made it so that these individual authors who wrote the epistles could claim that their letters were actually written by the author of the gospel. In other words, it's copying for the sake of presenting these texts under a false literary guise. And so that's what you find in these texts. If you open up 1st John, right at the beginning, the author of 1st John, the letter of 1st John, sounds like it was written by someone, precisely the person who wrote the Gospel of John. You'll hear him use the same key expressions at the beginning, word, life, all these kinds of key expressions that frame the prologue of the Gospel of John. Crucially, right at the beginning of the book, the author of 1st John speaks in a we and speaks in an I, just the way that the Gospel of John speaks in we language and I language. And this voice of 1st John, this author of 1st John, says that he has seen Jesus, what we have seen, what we have heard, what we have touched with our own hands, the word of life, he says. And these are all claims that echo what the gospel claims for its narrator, that this person has seen, heard, touched Jesus in the flesh. And so, there's this 2,000-year tradition that had suggested that the Gospel of John and the letters of John were written by the same author. Today, modern scholars know that these texts were not written by the same author, but what I argue in the book is there's actually a kernel of truth in this tradition. The letters of John were meant to look like they were written by that author. They were meant to look as if they were products by the same hand. They don't use the term disciple whom Jesus loved, but of course, the author himself, speaking in the first person, never exactly calls himself that. He only uses that expression in the third person. And so these texts that are written from a first person perspective wouldn't necessarily have that title. The titles they do have, though, are ones that I connect to what the Gospel's narrator presents himself as. So look for all that in chapter 5 of my book, and definitely look for my next book, Epistles of John, Origins, Authorship, Purpose, where I really develop these arguments in deep, deep detail.
And in my final question, why do you think the Gospel of John was written?
Yeah, so why write the Gospel of John? Especially if the Gospel of John knows the synoptics, why write another fourth gospel, right? I think fundamentally, the reason is that the author of John looked at the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And although he liked the general format and idea of these earlier Gospels, I think that he had different ideas from those earlier gospel writers about what Jesus taught, or about at least what was important about Jesus. I think that he looked at the Gospel of Mark and saw that there were certain holes a little bit in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus says in chapter 9 that some standing here will not taste death until the kingdom of God comes in power, until they see the kingdom of God coming in power. And I think that the author of John looked at that and wondered, how is it that people would see the kingdom of God here, before their deaths? I mean, in the case of the disciples, or sorry, let me rephrase that. How is it that the disciples would not taste death until they had seen the kingdom of God? So many of the disciples had died, perhaps all the disciples had died by the time the Gospel of John was written. And so the author had a different way of understanding that phrase. He understood that the kingdom Jesus was speaking of was not an earthbound kingdom, but a celestial spiritual kingdom. And this is what Jesus communicates to Pilate in John. My kingdom is not of this world. And so the Gospel of John decided to take that aspect of Mark and correct and rewrite it. And the author does this a few different places. In Mark, Jesus is struggling before his crucifixion. He's in the Garden of Gethsemane praying to God, let this cup of my suffering pass from me, my impending death pass from me. And instead, what John does is he constructs a Jesus who literally asks the question, should I ask that this cup be taken from me? No, of course not. I have to submit to the will of God. Where he thinks the question of passing the cup is unthinkable in John. This is a place where John competes with, pushes against the Gospel of Mark. I think another place where the Gospel of John definitely goes beyond the synoptics, as I mentioned, is in its vision of Jesus, its high Christology, its exalted view of Jesus as a divine being. And then also its very complex notion of how human beings become spirit beings, celestial beings, divine beings, even in this life. Something where the author might be taking cues from something like the writings of Paul, and is, I think, a little frustrated that Mark, Matthew, and Luke don't have these themes that are so central to this author's understanding of what Christianity was all about. And so the author crafted a gospel with new emphases, a gospel with new themes that communicates new ideas. He took, if you will, the raw shell of the synoptic gospels, infused them with new speeches and stories to communicate his own vision. And by the way, in that respect, he's doing something that we see time and again among second century gospels. That's what the Gospel of Thomas will do. That's what the Gospel of Mary does. That's what other gospels, like the Proto-Gospel of James, do and does. And so what we're seeing, I think, and what I argue in the book, is that the gospel author, the Gospel of John's author, might well have created the first apocryphal gospel. And I use that kind of term, as a little kind of playful tease a little bit. But the idea is this author wrote a kind of gospel that we're going to see written a lot in the 2nd century, a gospel that tries to rewrite, correct Jesus tradition, that introduces a deeper, more cryptic, more, if you will, Gnostic-like Jesus in some different respects, and that communicates a new vision of Christianity, or at least a different vision of Christianity than the one that Mark, Matthew, and Luke had in mind.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Hugo.
Yeah, thank you. It's great. Again, please, if you're interested, do pick up a copy. Oxford University Press has made this very, very affordable. It's only $34.99 on Amazon, and you can even get it cheaper with an author code on Oxford's own website. I can have that posted with us.
And the link to purchase the book will be in the description below and in the pinned comment. Thanks again, Hugo.
Thanks, Jacob.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.